My girlfriend had an affair with my high school best friend. I returned the favor with her sister and destroyed their relationship. Before we begin, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please click the subscribe button and support the channel. This way, you'll ensure you never miss amazing videos. I feel so betrayed right now by two of the people at least expected to hurt me this way. Before I had ever met my girl, 23, I was friends with Dan. We'd known each other since high school when we were both awkward kids with no social skills. We hit it off and stuck together through everything. We even kept in touch through college. Even though he went to school out of state while I went to school closer to home. He was always like a brother to me. We went to each other first with good or bad news and were always in each other's corner. If not for Dan, I would never have started dating Melissa. She and I met at a friend's party. She had an energy about her that drew me in. I was fine with watching her from afar, but Dan pushed me to talk to her. We clicked instantly and eventually left the party to get drinks somewhere else. We had a conversation and found out we had a lot in common. I know it sounds like a cliche, but right then it seemed like we were made for each other. We met for a few more dates after that, and within 2 weeks, we were official. Dan was the first person I called with the news. He was genuinely happy for me, especially since I hadn't had the best luck with women. With Melissa, though, things were different. We were that annoying couple that was way too clingy with each other. Wherever we went, we were inseparable, and when we were apart, we were always checking in on each other with phone calls and texts. Dan would often joke that I'd been whipped. Honestly, he was probably right. Looking back, it might have been a bit much. But hey, I was freshly in love. Dan would hang out with us at my place sometimes to watch movies and play games. Back then, I never noticed anything off between him and Melissa. I was happy that two of the most important people in my life got along so well. Sometimes Melissa would even suggest we invite Dan over to watch a movie with us or go out for drinks. I'd always happily agree. The three of us felt like the sort of close friend group you'd see in a sitcom. Think Seinfeld or something. It was about a year and a half into our relationship when I noticed things were getting strange. Melissa and I weren't spending as much time together. She'd cancel plans, saying she was busy with work or too tired to go out with me. We weren't texting as much as we used to. I just assumed we were finally moving out of the very long honeymoon phase. Not fun, but it's a thing that happens to every couple. What was weird, though, was that Dan was acting strange too. He was making up excuses about why he couldn't hang out. I didn't think much of it. I just thought life was getting in the way for both of them and it was a coincidence. I started to get suspicious when Melissa and I were making plans to watch a movie that Dan had been really hyped to see. I suggested to Melissa that we should all watch it together, but she didn't seem thrilled. She said we should watch it alone, just the two of us. I told her Dan would never forgive me if I watched it without him mentioning it had been ages since the three of us hung out together. I called Dan and told him about the movie. He was excited and practically cheered. But when I mentioned Melissa was coming, he got quiet and made an excuse saying Melissa and I should watch it together and he'd find another time. That was when the gears started turning. I'd been noticing their weird behavior, and seeing them both act strange at the same time made me reconsider. If I didn't know any better, I'd say the two of them were actively avoiding each other. Unfortunately, I felt there were very few reasons why that might have been. I wondered how I would bring it up. It was a weird topic, but I had to make sure things were okay between them. Is everything okay between you and Dan? When I said that, her head snapped toward me, which was all the confirmation I needed to know I was on the right track. What do you mean? Everything's fine between us? I told her. I realized it had been a while since the three of us hung out together. Either she was busy or he was busy, or both. Now she looked uncomfortable. I knew I was getting closer to the truth. She said we were all adults with busy schedules and couldn't hang out as much as we used to. She got defensive and told me I was thinking like a child and needed to grow up and focus on more important things than hanging around with friends all the time. The sudden change felt off to me, and I didn't know where all this was coming from. I decided to let it go, but the mood was already ruined and she left shortly after. Melissa was right that adults drift apart due to work and responsibilities. But that wasn't what was happening here. Melissa and Dan used to be great friends, but now it seemed like they were doing their best not to run into each other, and Melissa had been extremely defensive. It wasn't like her. There was something unusual going on. Was there bad blood between them? At this point, the idea of infidelity flashed in my mind. But having known Dan for so long and being so close to Melissa, I still didn't seriously entertain it. I decided I would talk to Dan instead. Melissa seemed touchy about it, but Dan was a guy, and guys are more straightforward about this kind of thing. I figured I'd get a straight answer from him and then we could figure out how to fix whatever was wrong between them. I didn't want anything to ruin the friendship we'd built. The next day, I called Dan after work and asked if he'd be free to grab some drinks. He hesitated for a second, but he eventually agreed when I mentioned Melissa wouldn't be around. We met up at the bar where the three of us used to hang out, and it almost felt like old times. We talked about random stuff, sports, work, and girls Dan liked. I wanted to ease into the real reason I invited him out, but I was also enjoying catching up like we used to. But Dan was sort of guarded in some of his answers, like he was trying to avoid certain topics. Is everything cool between you and Melissa? He looked up at me suddenly, and I was sure I saw panic in his eyes, but he quickly laughed. Yeah man, why do you ask? I told him I noticed they didn't hang out anymore and seemed to be avoiding each other. I told him how Melissa got defensive. When I brought it up, Dan took a long sip of his beer like he was stalling. You're just imagining things. We're cool. You know how life is. People get busy. He was trying to play it off, and that annoyed me. We were usually open with each other, and now he was being shifty. I told him, more assertively this time, to tell me what was going on. I don't want to get in the middle of anything. If Melissa is acting weird, that's between the two of you, okay? That was weird. It was extremely obvious at this point that Dan was being defensive too, which was very unlike him. I got mad at this point. Just talk to me. Why are you being so weird about it? Dan couldn't meet my eyes, and suddenly the realization flashed across my mind. It sounded too stupid to believe, too stupid to even say out loud. It's not that I hadn't considered it, but I had refused to think it was a real possibility. I decided to drop it as a joke and watch his reaction. Are you sleeping with her? Dan winced when I said that, and it felt like I'd been stabbed. I knew Dan better than anyone else, and that reaction might as well have been a nod and a thumbs up. Dan, tell me you're kidding. Talk to Melissa. Dan tried to stand up, but I put my hand on his shoulder and roughly forced him back into his seat. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. We sat there in silence for a while. I could feel the rage boiling inside me. My best friend was sitting across from me, looking guilty as hell and confirming my worst suspicions. Without saying a word, I tightened my grip on his shoulder so he couldn't feel my hand shaking. I shouted at him to say something, but he just looked down at his drink. My heart was pounding. Not Dan, not Melissa, the two of them, the two people I cared about the most. In that moment, I felt a wave of anger, and I wanted to hurt him the way he'd hurt me. I've never been a violent person, but before I knew it, I punched him and he fell onto the floor. He didn't fight back. He just looked like he was bracing himself for another attack. I'm sorry, it just happened, he mumbled. And that made me even angrier. You don't just happen to sleep with your best friend's girl. How long? He got up from the floor and finally faced me. Speaking quietly, he admitted that it had been going on for a couple of months. They'd gotten drunk one night and it happened out of nowhere. Then it kept happening, once. All this time, they'd been sneaking around behind my back while I was trying to keep everyone together. All the signs had been there and I'd ignored them. Maybe Melissa was right. I was thinking like a kid. I believed that just because these people were close to me, they couldn't hurt me. That was obviously a stupidly wishful thought. Now Dan wouldn't shut up. He was telling me, they knew it was wrong. They knew they were hurting me, so they tried to put some distance between themselves. Maybe he thought it would make things better, but it just pissed me off. My relationship was falling apart while these two found it impossible to keep their hands off each other. Writing about it now is pissing me off again. Do you know how ridiculous it is to say it just happened? I turned around to storm outside and Dan put his hand on my shoulder. It took everything I had not to punch him again, so I just shook him off and left. Outside, I walked without thinking. I wasn't in my right mind and the cool night air helped clear my head a bit. Eventually, I decided I needed to confirm everything with Melissa. I didn't know what I'd say or do when I saw her, but I knew I had to face her. I didn't bother calling to check if she was home. I didn't call an Uber either. I just walked. When I got home, I texted Melissa to come over and told her it was urgent. It took her about 30 minutes to arrive, but my anger hadn't cooled a bit. When I opened the door, she tried to kiss me, but I shrugged it off, pulled her inside and slammed the door behind us. What's the matter with you? She asked, looking annoyed. I know about you and Dan. She crossed her arms and stared defiantly. Know what about me and Dan? What are you talking about? She was still playing dumb and that pissed me off even more. I let her know that he'd told me everything. Her arms dropped and she looked down, guilt all over her face. That was all the confirmation I needed. Then she started apologizing. Babe, I'm so sorry. It was never supposed to happen. It was a stupid mistake that just kept happening. There it was again. It just kept happening. How could it just keep happening? They were having an affair, plain and simple. Why did they keep trying to minimize it? When was the last time I demanded? She looked unsure of what to say, probably trying to figure out what lie would be the most acceptable or what Dan might have told me. I lied, saying, "Remember, Dan already told me everything last week." She finally admitted, but we hadn't done anything for 3 weeks before that. That part stung hard. She couldn't convince me she regretted it. If they'd slept together just a week ago. I clapped sarcastically. "I can't believe you would do this." "I can't believe he would too. He was like a brother to me." She rolled her eyes and said, "I mean, he's not really your brother. That was supposed to make it okay?" I asked her, and she tried to say I was making it sound worse than it was. I let her know it didn't need my help to sound bad. It was already awful. I'd heard stories of people getting defensive after being caught, but I never thought I'd experience that. We fought over it for a few minutes. She started calling me childish again, deflecting blame. I didn't let her, and we went back and forth until I was shaking with rage. I couldn't believe she'd betrayed me so deeply and was still trying to pin the blame on me. I needed to move before I did something stupid. I was furious and ready to punch a wall. Instead, I stomped around the apartment, picking up all her things and tossing them into a pile in the living room. She followed me the whole time, pleading. I told her to pick up her stuff and get out or I'd throw it all out myself. She refused at first and kept begging, but I got tired of hearing her voice. Suddenly, the voice I loved was grating to me. I picked up her things, walked to the door and threw them into the hallway. She went out after them and I slammed the door behind her. She knocked on the door, calling my name for a few minutes, but I didn't answer. I spent some time getting myself together. I cried, had a few beers, and now I'm here, sharing my story. I don't know how to move on from this. I don't have anyone else. I just had the two of them. Melissa came into my life and took the only person I had apart from her. It hurts a lot, but I don't want to wallow. I'll pick up the pieces eventually, but first I want to think of a way to really make her pay. So I'm the guy whose girlfriend cheated on him with his best friend. I was in a bad place after the incident, but a lot of comments helped me out. I think I might even have a couple of new friends from people who reached out in my DMs. Thanks to everyone for the support. You all really helped me pull through. A popular opinion was that I should just forget about the two of them, but I couldn't. I wasn't about to let them have a happy life together after what they did to me. I wanted to do something that would ruin whatever they had between them. Because, let's face it, once I was out of the picture, they'd go right back to each other every chance they got. I couldn't stop them, but I wanted to make sure I felt better if it happened. One of you gave me the idea I eventually went with. I think it was meant as a joke, but it sounded like poetic justice to me. Now you have to sleep with her sister. Fair is fair. I couldn't get the idea out of my head. And just so happens, Melissa does have a sister. But I didn't know Claire very well. We'd met a few times, and she really seemed to like me. I liked her as well, though I'd never had any feelings for her, even though she looked like a younger, slightly prettier version of her sister. For one thing, I'm not a cheating piece of crap like Melissa. But times had changed. I wasn't with Melissa anymore, and this was war now. The plan wasn't really to sleep with Claire. For starters, I don't think I'm enough of a stud to charm any girl on demand. The game was simply to make out with her or even just attempt to kiss her. I just wanted Melissa to know I'd made a move on her sister so she'd taste a fraction of that kind of pain. I called Claire and started fake sobbing about my breakup. I told her how much it hurt and asked if I could come over and talk about it. Claire invited me over right away. She was sympathetic, listening the whole time. I didn't mention the cheating. I just cried about how perfect Melissa had been for me, how heartbroken I was, and how I thought we'd end up married. I laid it on thick, sobbing about how lost I felt. Claire listened attentively, comforting me with soft words. She even gave me a hug when I let a few tears fall. I could see Claire softening up, and I knew it was almost time to make my move. She was sitting beside me, one hand on mine, and she was misty-eyed too. I made myself look vulnerable, looking into her eyes with a hurt expression. I don't know how to go on. I wish I could move on, but it's too hard. Being here with you helps though. You're a good person, Claire. Better than Melissa. She smiled softly, clearly falling for the act. I leaned in and kissed her, and to my surprise, she didn't pull away. She didn't kiss me back right away, but eventually she did. I assumed she was weighing the situation and the scales eventually tipped my way. After that, things got a little hot and heavy, but we didn't go all the way. Eventually she pulled back flustered and said, "What are we doing?" I apologized and told her I'd gotten overwhelmed. I left as soon as I'd gathered my things, and before I was out the door I was already dialing Melissa. I told her to meet me at my place for a final talk. Melissa was waiting outside my door before I got back. First of all, she started, I just wanted to say I'm sorry. I didn't handle this well. I know I hurt. I cut her off because I didn't want her apology. There was no room for it, and I didn't want even a slight chance of feeling pity for her. It's fine. I'll forgive you for sleeping with Dan if you can. Forgive me? I said. She looked at me warily. What did you do? I kissed Claire. Actually, I did more than that. I made out with her. Melissa exploded. She screamed, cried, and called me every name in the book. She grabbed me by the shirt and she looked like she'd lost her mind. I shook her hands off and stepped back. How does that feel? I said. I figure if you can accidentally sleep with my best friend multiple times, then I can accidentally make out with your sister at least once. Melissa had no response to that. She just stood there, ugly, crying. I want you to know that you brought this all on yourself, I said. You didn't appreciate what you did to me, how badly you hurt me. So I had to let you know what it felt like. I felt great. I gotten under her skin. I'd shown her what she'd done to me. Maybe it was petty, but it felt incredibly satisfying. I didn't need to be the bigger man. I just wanted to win, and I had. After that I got a few texts from Dan. He was mad at me for going after Claire, and I reminded him he had no moral leg to stand on. After that, he stopped trying to berate me and just updated me on Melissa and Claire. He said he and Melissa had stopped seeing each other. She blamed him in part for what I'd done with her sister. He also said Melissa often brought me up when they talked, saying how much she regretted what she did. She and Claire weren't speaking much, and Claire hadn't contacted me at all. Dan asked me if there was still any chance the two of us could be friends. I told him point blank that I could never trust him again. I let him know outright that the only reason I was still talking to him was because I enjoyed hearing how much Melissa was hurting. He only replied with a wow, okay. I haven't heard from him since, and honestly, I'm glad to be rid of both of them. I've already started to move on and I'll forget them one day, but I made sure they won't forget me. That's what I find soothing.